A champagne flute shattering on marble sharp, bright, cutting through every voice in the ballroom. 300 people. 300 glasses frozen halfway through the air. Portia, red dress, red nails. Lips red as if drawn with a blade, steps forward, gives a cold smile. Speaks just loud enough for the entire room to hear. You do not belong here, sweetheart. Everyone knows who really runs this family, and it is certainly not some pregnant woman hiding in the corner. Elena, one hand pressed to her burning cheek, the other instinctively cradling her 6-month pregnant belly. She does not shed a single tear. She only slowly turns to face her husband. Elena, voice quiet. Not pleading, just a trembling question. Grant, aren't you going to do anything? Grant stands 3 steps away, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the floor. He does not step forward. Not a word, like a boy waiting for someone to tell him it is over. 300 people watching. Not one of them steps forward. Then from the far end of the hall, the silver-haired hotel manager parts the crowd, calm, unhurried. He stops before the woman who has just been humiliated and bows deeply. Walter, good morning, boss. The entire room holds its breath. The smile on Portia's lips freezes solid. That wealthy man thought he owned everything. He had no idea the wife he let be humiliated was the one who held everything he was standing on. The real story is only just beginning. Watch to the end to see how a woman everyone underestimated makes the whole room bow, and don't forget to leave a like if you believe she deserves it. The champagne flute hit the marble floor first. It made a sharp, bright sound, like a bell struck once and then silenced. The kind of sound that slices through 300 conversations at once. The kind that makes every head turn, every voice drop. Everybody goes still in that animal way humans go still when they sense something is about to go wrong. Then came the second sound, a hand against a cheek, open palm, full force. The crack of it traveled across the Whitfield Grand Ballroom like a gunshot wrapped in silk. 300 people stopped talking at the same moment. 300 champagne glasses froze halfway to 300 mouths. The string quartet in the far corner finished the phrase they were playing and then, mercifully, stopped. The last note hung in the air for a long, terrible second before it died. Elena Marsh stood under the central chandelier with one hand pressed to her burning face and the other resting instinctively, protectively, over the curve of her belly. Her ears were ringing. Her cheek felt like someone had pressed a hot iron to it. She could taste something metallic in her mouth. Not blood, just adrenaline. Just the sharp copper taste of a body preparing itself for something it did not want to feel. The woman who had hit her was still standing 3 feet away. Portia Kane. Red dress, red nails, red lipstick so precise it looked like it had been applied with a surgeon's hand. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. Sharp edges, no warmth. The kind of woman who entered rooms like she was daring them to look away. She was daring them now. You do not belong here, Portia said. She said it loud. She said it clearly. She said it at the exact volume needed for the photographer near the step and repeat banner to catch every syllable. Her voice carried across the ballroom the way voices carry in cathedral spaces, bouncing off marble and glass and the faces of 300 people who had suddenly become an audience. Everyone knows who really runs this family. Sweetheart, Portia continued. She smoothed the front of her red dress with one hand, casual and deliberate, as if she had not just struck a pregnant woman across the face in front of half the city's social register. And it is not the pregnant wife hiding in the corner. Elena did not move. She had learned, over 11 months of marriage to Grant Whitfield, that stillness bought her time. Not much, a few seconds. Just enough to swallow the first thing she wanted to say and find the second thing. The smarter thing. The thing that would not give anyone in this room more ammunition than they already had. She used those seconds now. She stood very still under the chandelier. Hand on her cheek, hand on her belly. And she took in the room. 6 months pregnant. Ankles swollen from standing in heels she should not have worn but had worn anyway because Grant liked the way she looked in them. A ballroom full of his business partners. His father's oldest friends. 2 city councilmen she had been introduced to earlier that evening, and already forgotten. A photographer from the society page, and 112 round tables covered in white linen and orchid centerpieces that someone on Grant's team had spent 4 days arranging, and her husband, 6 feet away, standing right there, not defending her, not stepping forward, not putting his body between his pregnant wife and the woman who had just slapped her. Not doing anything at all except standing there in his tailored tuxedo with his jaw tight and his eyes on the floor, like a boy caught between 2 adults fighting. Waiting to be told it was over so he could go back to pretending it had never happened. Grant, Elena said quietly. Not a plea, not a cry for help. A question. The simplest question a wife could ask her husband after being struck in public. A question that should not have needed asking at all. He did not answer. Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped. The sound was thin and performative, the kind of gasp that signals social discomfort rather than genuine shock. Someone else cleared his throat. A waiter near the kitchen doors shifted his weight. Nobody moved. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody crossed the invisible line that had appeared around Elena the instant Portia's hand made contact with her face. 300 people, and not one of them came to help her. Elena cataloged that. She would remember it later, lying awake in a house that had never felt like hers, running through the faces one by one. The councilman's wife in the blue gown who had complimented Elena's earrings 20 minutes earlier. The business partner who had shaken her hand and called her Mrs. Whitfield with a smile that now seemed, in retrospect, more like a smirk. The caterer near the dessert table who looked away so fast it was almost a flinch. 300 people, and not one of them, except one, Walter Combs, stepped through the crowd. He came from the direction of the hotel's main lobby, which meant he had heard the commotion and walked toward it instead of away from it. He was the hotel's general manager, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and a dark suit that fit him the way suits fit men who have been wearing them every day for 30 years. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved. He did not rush. He did not push past anyone. He simply walked, steady and unhurried, through the crowd of people who were doing nothing, and he did not stop until he was standing beside Elena. He did not look at Portia. He did not look at Grant. He did not address the room or raise his voice or make any kind of scene. He simply took Elena's elbow, gently, the way you take the elbow of someone who might fall. And he said the only thing that mattered. This way, Mrs. Marsh, not Mrs. Whitfield Marsh. Nobody in that ballroom noticed the correction. Nobody caught the deliberate use of her maiden name, her father's name, the name that used to hang in brass letters above the front door of this very hotel before Grant's family had it replaced. Nobody noticed because nobody in that room, except Walter Combs, understood what that name actually meant. Elena noticed. She heard it the way you hear your own name called in a crowded room. Sharp, clear, unmistakable. She held on to it the way you hold on to a railing on a dark staircase. When you cannot see the next step, but you know, if you just keep gripping, you will find it. Walter led her through the crowd. People parted, not because he asked them to, because he moved with the quiet, immovable authority of a man who had spent 30 years watching rich people behave badly and had never once let it change the way he treated anyone. He walked her past the coat check, past the main bar where two bartenders stood frozen with bottles in their hands, past the side exit and into the service hallway behind the ballroom. The service hallway smelled like bleach and warm bread. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The floor was gray linoleum, scuffed from years of room service carts and kitchen staff moving fast on 12-hour shifts. It was the ugliest hallway Elena had ever been grateful to see. Walter led her past the kitchen, where she could hear voices speaking rapid Spanish and the clatter of plates being loaded, through a door marked staff only, and into a small office with a single window that looked out over the parking garage. There was a desk, a chair, a wilting plant in a ceramic pot that someone had written Walter in marker on the bottom of. He pulled out the chair for her. "Sit before you fall down," he said, not unkindly, just the way you talk to someone you have known a long time, someone you have watched grow up, someone you do not need to perform politeness for. Elena sat. Her hand was still shaking. She pressed it flat against the desk to stop it. The wood was cool, solid, real. "Do you want ice for your face?" Walter asked. He was already reaching for the small refrigerator in the corner. No, her voice came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel. "I want to know why nobody in that room did anything." Walter was quiet for a long moment. He leaned against the edge of his desk and looked at her, and Elena could see, in his eyes, the particular kind of sadness that comes from watching someone arrive at a conclusion you reached a long time ago. He had known Elena since she was 8 years old. Walter Combs had worked the front desk of this hotel the year Robert Marsh, Elena's father, bought it. He had watched her grow up eating room service pancakes in the penthouse suite, while her father ran meetings 2 floors below. He had called her Miss Elena for 20 years before she became Mrs. Whitfield, and even after the name change, even after the wedding, he had never quite been able to say the new name without a small pause before it, as if his mouth was still catching up to a reality his instincts had already rejected. "They did not do anything," Walter said slowly, "because they think Grant Whitfield owns this hotel, this company, and everything in it. They think you are just his pregnant wife." Elena looked up. "They are wrong," Walter said. "Are they not?" It was not a question. It was a confirmation. The kind of sentence that does not need an answer Because both people in the room already know the truth it contains. Elena did not answer it. Not yet. Instead, she looked down at her hands. At the wedding ring that suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. Heavier than it had any morning. And she let herself, for the first time in 11 months of marriage, admit the thought she had been keeping locked away in the back of her mind like a letter she was too afraid to open. I never should have let him think it was his. The ring, the name, the ballroom, all of it. She sat in Walter's office for a long time. She could hear, faintly, through the walls, the sound of the gala resuming, music starting up again, voices returning to their normal volume, the clink of glasses, the machinery of polite society grinding back to life, smoothing over the ugly thing that had just happened, folding it into the evening's gossip the way a body absorbs a bruise. First it is shocking, then it is just a mark, then it fades. Elena's cheeks still burned. She touched it once, lightly, with her fingertips. It would not fade. Not this time. The car ride home was silent. Grant drove. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his posture rigid in the way of a man bracing for impact. But his jaw had that stubborn set Elena had learned to dread over the last 11 months. The tightened muscle just below his left ear, the way his eyes narrowed slightly at the edges. She knew that look. It was the look of a man rehearsing his excuse before anyone had even asked him for one. Elena sat in the passenger seat and watched the city lights blur past the window. Red, yellow, white, red again. The leather seat was cold against her back. Her feet ached. She had been standing in those heels for 4 hours. And now, sitting down, the pain arrived all at once like it had been waiting for permission. She did the thing she always did when her chest got tight. She picked up her phone. She checked the screen. Nothing. No messages. No notifications. Just the time. 9:47. She locked it, unlocked it, locked it again. 3 times. As if the third time the screen might show her something that made sense of the last hour. It did not. She put the phone in her lap and stared at it. The screen went dark. She could see her own reflection in it. A face she barely recognized. Swollen cheek. Smudged mascara she had not had the energy to fix. Eyes that looked older than 28. She is just going through something, Grant finally said. They were 4 red lights from home. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man selecting his words the way you select tools from a kit. He chose the one he thought would cause the least damage. Portia. Her divorce settlement fell through last week. She was not herself tonight. Elena turned her head slowly. She slapped me. Grant, I know that. In front of 300 people, while I am 6 months pregnant with your child. I know that. Elena, his voice cracked. Sharp and defensive. The way it always did right before the pivot. She could feel it coming. The shift. The rerouting of the conversation from what he had done, or rather what he had not done, to how unfair it was that she was making him feel bad about it. You think I wanted that to happen? You think I enjoyed standing there? I think, Elena said very quietly, that you did not move. He had no answer for that. The light turned green. He drove. The streets were wet from an earlier rain that Elena had not noticed. The tires made a soft hissing sound on the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded. Elena counted the blocks. 7 more until the turn onto Whitfield Lane. 6-5. I froze, Grant said. His voice was smaller now, almost convincing. Elena, you have to understand, it happened so fast. I did not even process what was happening until it was already over. She let that sit between them in the car like a physical object. A box. A stone. Something that took up space and had weight. It took 4 seconds, Elena said. I counted. I was the one being hit and I still had time to count. Grant exhaled, long and slow, through his nose. The way men exhale when they want the other person to understand how difficult this conversation is for them. Can we just get home? Can we just get inside and sit down and talk about this like adults? Like adults. As if she were the one being childish. As if having your face slapped by your husband's mistress and then wanting to talk about it in the car was somehow the unreasonable position. Elena turned back to the window and watched the last few blocks go by. She did not say another word until they pulled into the driveway. The Whitfield estate was lit up the way it always was. Every window, every walkway light. The landscaping spotlights that made the front garden look like a magazine cover at all hours. Elena had once found it beautiful. Now, climbing out of the car with her swollen ankles and her burning cheek and her husband already 3 steps ahead of her on the walkway, she found it exhausting. All that light, and none of it warm. She went straight upstairs. She had not meant to go to the nursery. Her feet just took her there, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. The nursery was the one room in this house that felt like hers. She had painted it herself, back in month 2 of the pregnancy. before her doctor told her to stop climbing ladders. Soft yellow walls, a warm, buttery color she had mixed herself at the hardware store, ignoring the decorator Grant's mother had tried to hire for her. A row of hand-painted clouds along the ceiling border that she had done with a toothpick and a tiny brush, lying flat on her back on a stepladder with her feet braced against the top rung. Because she could have afforded a decorator 10 times over, but she had wanted to do it herself. She sat down in the rocking chair in the corner and put both hands over her belly and breathed. The baby shifted, a slow rolling movement under her palms. An elbow, a knee, she could never tell which. Just something small and alive, and completely unconcerned with the disaster happening outside this room. She rocked. The chair creaked, back and forth, back and forth. The sound of it was the only steady thing in her life right now. She thought about the last 3 months, not the big things, the small ones. The ones that had accumulated so gradually she had not noticed them piling up until tonight, when the pile finally collapsed. A comment about her weight at a work dinner, made casually by one of Grant's partners while Grant sat beside her and said nothing. Not a cruel comment, exactly, just a careless one. Just the kind of thing a man says to a pregnant woman when he thinks of her as furniture. "You are really filling out, are you not?" he had said. And the table had laughed. And Grant had sipped his wine and looked at his phone. A meeting, 2 months ago, where Grant introduced her to a group of investors as my wife instead of by her name. "Elena," she had said, extending her hand. "I am Elena," and the men had smiled politely and then turned back to Grant as if she had not spoken at all. A birthday. Her 28th birthday, 6 weeks ago. Grant had told her he had something special planned. What arrived was a bouquet of lilies, delivered by his assistant, with a card that read "Happy Birthday" from Grant in the assistant's handwriting. He had come home that night with takeout and no memory of the flowers. She had forgiven every one of those things. She had filed them away under the category of "he is busy and he is under pressure, and this is just what marriage is sometimes." She had bent herself around each small failure the way a tree bends around a fence post, slowly, permanently, until the bending became the shape. And now this, a hand against her face, a room full of people watching, a husband who did not move. She thought of the wedding, 11 months ago, the vows Grant had written himself. Beautiful vows, the kind that made her mother cry and her father's old friends nod with grudging approval. Words about partnership, about standing together, about being the person who holds the umbrella in the storm. She thought of the man standing frozen in that ballroom tonight, watching another woman raise her hand to his wife's face and doing nothing. Somewhere along the way, Elena thought, I became invisible. She did not cry. She was surprised by that. She had expected tears. She had almost wanted them, the way you want a storm to break on a humid day, just to release the pressure. But the tears did not come. What came instead was something quieter, something colder, a clarity that felt like stepping out of a warm house into winter air. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time, an hour, maybe more. The house settled around her. The heating system clicked on and off. Pipes expanded in the walls with small, metallic sounds. Downstairs, she could hear Grant on the phone. Low voice, careful voice, the particular tone he used when he thought no one could hear him. Soft, reassuring, the voice of a man comforting someone, not her. She did not need to hear the words to know who he was talking to. What nobody at that gala knew was this: not Portia Kane, not the councilman, not the photographer from the society page, not even most of Grant's own family. The people who sat at Thanksgiving dinner every year and passed the wine and assumed, comfortably, that the Whitfield name was the name that mattered in this marriage. What nobody knew was that Elena Marsh had not married into money. She had been born into it. And then, 4 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when her father Robert Marsh died of a sudden heart attack at 62, collapsing on the 18th hole of his weekly golf game with a half-finished cigar between his fingers and his cell phone, still warm in his pocket from a call he had been making to her. Elena had inherited every single share of Marsh Holdings. Every share, every asset, every piece of paper with a number on it. The hotel chain, 14 properties in 7 cities, including the Whitfield Grand Ballroom, which had not always been called the Whitfield Grand, but which Elena would get to in a moment. The real estate portfolio, commercial and residential buildings spread across the city like chess pieces her father had spent 30 years placing, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that turns ordinary men into quiet empires. The private equity fund that had no public website and no social media presence and no name anyone would recognize at a cocktail party, but that quietly financed nearly half of the commercial development in the city. Apartment buildings, office towers, the new waterfront district that the mayor had cut the ribbon on last year, smiling for cameras. never once mentioning the name of the woman whose family fund had written the check that made the whole thing possible. All of it, held in a trust that Elena controlled entirely, structured by her father's lawyer, Harold Vance, with a single, deliberate instruction that Robert Marsh had dictated one afternoon. Sitting in Harold's office with his reading glasses on and a legal pad in his lap, choosing every word as carefully as he had chosen every investment. Nobody manages this but her. Not a husband, not a board member, not a committee, not anyone, until she chooses to hand it over herself. If she ever chooses to hand it over herself, which, in my experience, Harold Marsh never does. Harold had written it down. He had built the trust around that sentence the way an architect builds a building around a load-bearing wall. Everything depended on it. Everything held because of it. Elena had been 24 years old when her father died. She had been in graduate school, studying urban development, writing a thesis on sustainable housing policy that she never finished because 3 days after the funeral she was sitting in Harold Vance's office learning that she owned more than she had ever understood. Her father had never told her the exact numbers. He had told her other things. He had told her, when she was 12, that the hotel they were having breakfast in was theirs, and she had asked what that meant, and he had said it means we take care of it. He had told her, when she was 16 and applying to colleges, that she would never need to worry about money, and she had asked what he meant by never, and he had said, I mean never, Elena, I mean your grandchildren. He had told her, when she was 21 and starting her first internship, that the most important thing about wealth was not having it but knowing when to show it and when to keep it quiet. Most people, her father had said, sitting across from her at his kitchen table one Sunday morning, his coffee getting cold because he always forgot to drink it when he was talking about something that mattered. Most people. Elena, they get money and the first thing they do is make sure everyone knows. They put their name on buildings. They buy the loudest car. They walk into rooms and wait for people to recognize them. And those people, every single one of them, eventually lose control. Because once everyone knows what you have, everyone wants a piece of it, and you spend the rest of your life defending instead of building. He had paused. He had looked at her over his reading glasses. The people who last, he had said, are the ones nobody sees coming. Elena had remembered that. She had carried it with her through 4 years of quietly managing an empire that nobody, outside of Harold Vance and a handful of trustees, knew she controlled. She had carried it with her when she met Grant Whitfield at a charity auction 2 years ago, and he had smiled at her and asked her name, and she had told him Elena Marsh, and watched his face for the flicker of recognition. It had come. Grant knew the Marsh name. Everyone in this city knew the Marsh name. Her father had owned hotels and funded buildings and sat on charity boards. Robert Marsh had been, in his quiet way, one of the most influential men in the city for 30 years. But Grant, like everyone else, assumed the empire had died with the man. He assumed the holdings had been parceled out, sold off, absorbed by some corporate entity with a forgettable name. He assumed, because it was easier and more flattering to assume, that Elena Marsh was what she appeared to be. A young woman, pretty, smart enough, well-connected but not powerful, a good match, a name that would look nice next to his. He had never once asked what her father's company was actually worth. He had never asked to see the books. He had never asked, in 2 years of dating and 11 months of marriage, a single question that would have led him to the truth that was sitting right in front of him, in the woman sitting right in front of him. The whole time, he had not asked because he had not needed to. He believed he already knew. This was the thing about Grant Whitfield that Elena had come to understand slowly. The way you come to understand the slope of a hill only after you have been walking downhill for a long time without realizing it. Grant did not see what he was not looking for. He saw what confirmed what he already believed. He believed he was the wealthier spouse. He believed the Whitfield name carried the weight in the marriage. He believed, with the bone-deep confidence of a man whose family name had been on buildings for 2 generations, that Elena's role in their partnership was supportive, secondary, ornamental, and Elena had let him believe it. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, because her father had trained her, without ever saying so directly, to do exactly what she had done. Watch, wait, say very little about what you actually own. Let people show you who they are before you show them what you are worth. She had watched Grant for 2 years. She had waited. She had said very little. And tonight, in the ugliest possible way, standing in a ballroom with her cheek on fire and her baby kicking under her hand, she had finally, conclusively, undeniably learned who Grant Whitfield was. He was a man who did not move. The next morning, Elena called Naomi Whitmore. Naomi was her best friend, her father's goddaughter, and more importantly, the corporate attorney who managed the operational side of Marsh Holdings. She was 31 years old, sharp as a paper cut, and she had been waiting for this phone call since the wedding. Naomi answered on the second ring. She always did, as if she had been sitting by the phone waiting for exactly this call for 11 months. I saw the video, Naomi said before Elena could speak. Her voice was tight with the kind of anger that hides behind competence. Someone posted it already. It has been up since last night. Elena, are you okay? Is the baby all right? The baby is fine. Elena's voice was steady now, flat and clear, the way a voice gets after a long night of not sleeping, when all the emotion has been burned off and what is left is just signal, just information, just the clean, stripped-down version of what needs to happen next. Naomi, I need you to pull the ownership documents on the Whitfield grant, not the branding agreement, not the management contract, the actual deed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long one. Elena could hear Naomi breathing. You are going to do it, Naomi said. It was not a question. Elena's whole life, apparently, had turned into a series of statements that did not need answering. I am going to do what my father would have done, Elena said. I am going to let people see who is actually holding the keys. Elena remembered the prenup meeting the way you remember weather from a bad day, not the words exactly, not the specific clauses or the paragraph numbers or the legal language that Harold Vance had spent 3 weeks drafting. What she remembered was the temperature of the room, the way the air conditioning in the conference room was set too low, the way Grant's cologne smelled sharper than usual, like he had put on too much that morning, the way people do when they are nervous, the way the conference table was too wide, so that when Grant reached across it to hold her hand, he had to lean forward in his chair, and the gesture, which was meant to look casual and intimate, instead looked strained. Grant had insisted on the prenup. He had brought it up 11 months ago, 2 weeks before the wedding, sitting across from her at a restaurant where the lighting was expensive and the portions were small and the wine list was longer than the menu. I think we should do this, he had said, setting down his fork and looking at her with the expression he used when he wanted to seem both serious and reasonable at the same time. Open eyes, slight nod, voice half a register lower than usual, just to protect both of us. So money never has to be part of what we feel for each other. Elena had thought, at the time, that this was strange, not the prenup itself. She understood prenups. Her father had explained them to her when she was 19, matter-of-factly, the way he explained everything. A prenup is a conversation about money that you have while you still like each other, he had said. It is better than having it later, when you do not. What was strange was who was asking. Grant Whitfield's family, at the time of the wedding, was worth roughly a third of what Elena's trust held. The Whitfield construction business had been struggling for 3 years. 2 major projects had gone over budget. A lawsuit from a subcontractor had drained their legal reserves. Grant's father, Harold Whitfield, had been quietly selling off personal real estate to keep the company's credit lines open. Grant, in other words, was the poorer party in this marriage, by a significant margin, and yet he was the one insisting on the prenup. He was the one who had hired the attorney. He was the one who sat across that conference table with his hand reaching across the gap, saying, "It is just protection," as if protection were a neutral word, as if there were no direction to it, as if a shield does not tell you something about what the person holding it thinks the threat is. Elena, 27 years old and in love and tired of being the person everyone assumed was only valued for herself when actually the opposite was quietly, exhaustingly true, had signed it. She had signed it because she loved him. She had signed it because she was tired of fighting, tired of calculating, tired of every relationship in her life being filtered through the question of what she was worth in dollars. She had signed it because part of her, the young and hopeful part, the part that wanted to believe Grant saw her and not her father's portfolio, thought maybe this was what trust looked like. 2 people agreeing to keep money separate. 2 people saying the love is enough. She had not needed to fight. Harold Vance, who had known Elena since she was a child and who had served her father for 20 years and who did not, as a general rule, trust anyone whose last name was not Marsh, had drafted the prenup language himself. He had drafted it years before Elena had even met Grant, sitting in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, working from a single instruction Robert Marsh had given him during one of their last meetings. She will marry someone eventually, Robert had said. Harold would tell Elena this later, years later, in the same flat voice he used for everything, as if he were reading from a transcript. And whoever she marries, Harold, I want you to make sure the trust is untouchable, not hidden, untouchable. There is a difference. She should not have to lie about what she has. She just should not have to share it with someone who has not earned the right to know. Harold had built the prenup around that instruction. Every clause protecting marital assets was carefully, deliberately, specifically defined. Marital assets meant anything acquired jointly after the date of the marriage. That was the key phrase. After the date of the marriage. Marsh Holdings had been acquired by Elena's father in 1994. Elena had inherited it in full 4 years before the wedding. It had never, for one single day, belonged to Grant Whitfield. It had never been marital property. It had never been joint. It had never been his. Grant had walked out of that prenup meeting, believing he had protected himself from a woman who might one day divorce him and take half his family name's remaining assets. He had shaken Harold Vance's hand and smiled and said something about being glad they could handle this like adults. He had, without realizing it, signed away any claim to ever touching hers. Elena thought about this now, 3 days after the gala, sitting in the kitchen of the Whitfield estate while Grant tried to apologize. He did it the way he always did, with grand gestures instead of honest ones. Flowers arrived first, a massive arrangement of white roses and lilies that filled the front hallway with a smell so sweet it made Elena nauseous. Then a spa reservation she did not want at a place she had never heard of. Then a dinner reservation at the restaurant where he had proposed, as if returning to the location where something good had once happened could undo the thing that had happened since. I talked to Portia, Grant said finally. They were sitting at the kitchen table. Elena had a plate of food in front of her that she had barely touched. Grilled salmon, asparagus, a glass of water with lemon. Everything arranged perfectly on the plate by their housekeeper, who had looked at Elena that morning with something that might have been pity and might have been something else entirely. She is not going to be around anymore. I promise you that. You promise, Elena repeated. Elena, he reached across the table for her hand. She let him take it, mostly because she was too tired to pull away, mostly because some old, foolish, stubborn part of her still wanted this to have a version where he said something that fixed it. I love you. I love our baby. What happened at the gala was a mistake. It was a scene. It was not. It did not mean anything about how I feel. You did not move, Elena said again. It was becoming the only sentence she had left for him. The one fact that no amount of flowers or spa reservations could decorate away. A woman slapped me, your child's mother, and you stood there and let it happen. And then you got in the car and told me she is going through something. Grant's jaw tightened. The muscle below his left ear jumped. And there it was. The pivot, right on schedule. The thing Naomi had warned her about. Sitting in Elena's apartment 2 years ago when Elena first started dating Grant, saying, men like that, Elena, men who come from families like that, they apologize until they decide the apology is costing them too much dignity. And then they turn it around. They make you the problem. Watch for it. You are being dramatic, Grant said. He pulled his hand back. I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me? Elena looked at him across the table. The imported marble counters he had picked out, the wine fridge he had insisted on, the pendant lights over the island that he had chosen from a catalog without asking her opinion, the whole beautiful shell of a house that she had quietly funded more of than he would ever know. I am not crazy, she thought. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what happened and I know what did not happen. And no amount of rearranging the words is going to make me doubt the thing I felt when his hand did not move. She stood up from the table. I want you to sleep in the guest room, she said, starting tonight. For the first time in 11 months. Grant did not argue. That night, after she heard the guest room door close down the hall, Elena locked the bathroom door and sat down in the empty bathtub, fully dressed, knees pulled up as far as her belly allowed, still wearing the old t-shirt she had changed into hours ago, and the cotton shorts that were the only thing that fit her comfortably now, and the mismatched socks she had grabbed from the drawer without looking. Because at some point in the last 3 days, the part of her brain that cared about matching socks had simply stopped functioning. She did not run the water. She just sat there, in the porcelain quiet, with her back against the cold curve of the tub and her arms wrapped around her knees and her eyes open in the half-dark. The bathroom was too big. That was a strange thing to think. Sitting in a bathtub at 11:30 at night with mascara she had not washed off still faintly smudged under her eyes. But it was true. This bathroom was enormous. A freestanding tub, a walk-in shower with 3 rainheads, heated floors, a marble vanity that stretched the entire length of one wall, with double sinks and a mirror framed in brushed gold that made everything it reflected look expensive. Elena had never chosen any of it. The bathroom, like the rest of the house, had been decorated before she moved in. Grant's mother had hired the designer. Grant's mother had chosen the fixtures, the tile, the towels, the shade of paint on the walls, a color that the designer had called moonstone but which Elena privately thought of as rich people gray. She sat in the tub and listened to the pipes tick as the house settled around her. Old houses make sounds at night. Creaks, taps, small mechanical sighs as the heating system cycled on and off. Elena's father's house, the one she had grown up in, the one she had sold 2 years ago because Grant said they did not need two houses, had made sounds like this too. But those sounds had been familiar. These were the sounds of a house she lived in but had never belonged to. This was the thing nobody told you about heartbreak in a marriage that was still, technically, alive. It did not arrive as one clean cut. It did not arrive as a slap. Although a slap had been part of it, it arrived in installments. A comment at dinner, a silence in a car, a hand that reached across a table when beat too late to mean anything, a birthday card in someone else's handwriting, a door closing down the hall. Elena pressed her palms flat against the bottom of the tub. The porcelain was smooth and cool. She could feel the grain of her own fingerprints against it, the tiny ridges and whorls that made her hands uniquely hers. She thought about her father. Robert Marsh had been a quiet man. Not cold, quiet. There was a difference. Cold men withheld warmth because they did not have it to give. Quiet men had warmth but chose carefully where to put it. Her father had put all of his into two things: his daughter and his work, in that order. He had not been given to advice. He did not deliver speeches or write letters or record messages for the future. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind who showed up, who sat with you, who drove you to school every morning, even when he had a meeting at 7, because the drive was 15 minutes, and 15 minutes was enough time to be together without having to fill the silence with words. But there was one thing he had told her, one sentence. The year before he died, they were sitting at his kitchen table. She was helping him review a contract. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the lavender hand soap he kept by the sink. Outside, it was October, and the trees in the backyard were turning, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle that made everything on the table glow. Elena, he had said, looking up from the contract with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The people who deserve your empire are the ones who never ask to see the size of it. She had not understood it then. She had been 23. She had never been in love. She had never had someone reach for her hand across a table and say, "I love you," while meaning, "I love what I think you are." She had not yet learned the difference between someone who values you and someone who has simply not yet discovered your price. She understood it now, sitting fully clothed in a dry bathtub in a house that was not hers, with her wedding ring catching the bathroom light and sending small bright fragments across the ceiling. She understood exactly what her father had meant. Grant had never asked to see the size of her empire because he had never believed she had one. He had looked at her and seen a woman. Smart, yes. Pretty, yes. From a good family, yes. But ultimately supportive, ultimately secondary, ultimately someone whose role in the story was to stand beside him, not in front of him, never in front of him. He had never asked because he had never thought to ask. And that, Elena realized, was worse than if he had asked and she had lied. Because a lie can be corrected, but the failure to see someone, the consistent, comfortable, years-long failure to look at the person standing next to you and wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to them than you had assumed. That was not a mistake you could fix with flowers and a dinner reservation. That was a character. She stayed in the tub a long time. The house settled. The pipes clicked. Down the hall, behind the guest room door, she could hear nothing. Not movement, not breathing, not the sound of a man lying awake wondering what he had done wrong. Nothing. When she finally climbed out, her dress creased and her back aching from the awkward angle, something in her had gone still and clear. The way the sky goes still right after a storm passes through. Everything washed. Everything visible. The air thin and sharp. She picked up her phone and called Harold Vance. It was after midnight. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice rough with sleep. "I want the trust activated," she said. "Full operational control. My name on everything. Effective this week." There was a pause. She could hear Harold sitting up in bed, the rustle of sheets, the click of a lamp turning on. Elena, his voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man who had been waiting for this call for 4 years but who still, even now, felt the need to make sure she understood what it meant. You know what that means. It means people will find out exactly who owns what. All of it. The hotel chain, the Whitfield Grand, the development fund. Your name goes on everything publicly. There will be no more distance between you and the holdings. Are you sure you are ready for that kind of exposure? Especially now, with the baby. I have spent 2 years being invisible in my own life. Harold, Elena said. Her voice did not shake. I am not scared of being seen. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing she had not expected. Your father would be proud of you right now. Elena closed her eyes. She pressed the phone against her ear and let those words sit in her chest for a moment. in the space where the weight had been, in the space where something new was starting to grow. "I know," she said. She hung up. She went to bed. She slept. For the first time in 3 days, without dreaming. Grief has strange habits. Elena's grandmother used to say that. She was a small woman from a small town who had married a man who turned out to be worth more than anyone in that small town had imagined. And she had spent the rest of her life learning how to be rich without becoming someone she did not recognize. She used to say, "When the world falls apart, the women in this family reorganize kitchen drawers." She said it like a joke. She meant it like a prayer. At 2 in the morning, 4 nights after the gala, Elena found herself standing in the kitchen in an old t-shirt with her hair pulled back, pulling every drawer open one by one. She could not sleep. She had tried. She had lied in bed for 2 hours with her eyes closed and her mind running. A hamster on a wheel, going over the same ground again and again. The slap, the silence, the dinner table, the guest room door closing, the phone call to Harold, the conversation she still had not had with Grant's father, the meeting on Monday that she had not yet told Grant about, the baby shifting inside her, oblivious to all of it, pressing a foot or a fist against her ribs like a small, persistent knock. So she got up. She put on her slippers and walked downstairs in the dark and turned on the kitchen light. And before she knew what she was doing, she had every drawer open and every utensil laid out across the counter. Spatulas, measuring cups, a set of mismatched forks nobody used, a whisk with a bent handle, 3 bottle openers, none of which Elena could remember buying, a garlic press still in its packaging, wooden spoons, some old and stained, some new and smooth, all tangled together in a drawer that had no organizer because no one in this house had ever thought to buy one. She laid them all out, every piece, lined them up in rows across the imported marble countertops that Grant had chosen from a catalog and then complained about the cost of, even though the cost had come from Elena's account, routed through the household fund she had quietly set up to cover the difference between what Grant earned and what Grant spent. He did not know about the fund. He did not know that the marble, the appliances, the wine fridge, the landscaping, the monthly payments on the driveway he had insisted on repaving last spring, all of it, every dollar, came from a trust he did not know existed, controlled by a woman he had apparently decided was less important than his comfort. Elena sorted. Forks with forks, spoons with spoons, knives in a row by size. She worked slowly, methodically, the way her grandmother used to, picking up each piece and looking at it and putting it in its proper place. There was something in the act that she needed. The simplicity of it, the logic. Every object belonged somewhere. Every tool had a function. You just had to look at it clearly enough to see where it went. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up. Naomi, 2:17 in the morning, a single line. "You up, always now," apparently. Elena typed back, "I have the documents ready. Full ownership package. Whenever you say go." Elena set the phone down. She looked around the kitchen. The pendant lights cast warm circles on the countertop. The sorted utensils gleamed in neat rows. The house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator humming. She picked the phone back up. "Go," she typed. "Monday, the shareholder meeting. I want him there. Grant. All of them." Elena wrote. "Grant, his father. The board. Portia can come too if she likes. I want everyone in that room when they find out who has actually been signing their paychecks." She put the phone down and finished sorting the last drawer. Every fork in its place. Every spoon where it belonged. Every knife clean and straight and pointing in the same direction. She closed the drawers one by one. The soft sound of wood sliding into wood, latches catching, things fitting where they were supposed to fit. For the first time in days, she felt something that was not grief or anger or exhaustion. It was something older, quieter, something her grandmother would have recognized. She went back upstairs. She lay down. She put her hand on her belly and felt the baby shift, slow and sleepy, settling into a new position like a bird adjusting on a branch. She slept. By Friday, the video from the gala had 2 million views. Elena found this out the way she found out most things about her own life these days. Not by looking. By being told. Naomi called at 7 in the morning with a number and a voice that was equal parts outrage and dark amusement. 2 million, Naomi said. And climbing. Someone captioned it. I will not read you the caption. Actually, I will. Billionaire lets Mistress slap his pregnant wife. Internet is furious. That is the clean version. You do not want to know the others. Elena was sitting in the nursery. She had been sitting there for an hour already. In the rocking chair. In the yellow room with the painted clouds. Watching the morning light move slowly across the ceiling. She had developed a routine over the last 5 days. Wake up early. Go to the nursery. Sit. Rock. Think. Avoid Grant, who was still sleeping in the guest room and had started leaving the house before she came downstairs. As if physical distance could substitute for the conversation they both knew was coming, but neither wanted to start. The comments are a wall, Naomi continued, all of it aimed at Grant, which, fair. But the story has a second life I did not expect. Portia gave an interview. Elena stopped rocking. She what? A gossip blog. One of the big ones. She called them. They did not call her. She apparently read the public mood as an opportunity instead of a warning. Naomi paused. Elena could hear her breathing. The particular breath Naomi took before delivering information she knew would hurt. She said, and I am quoting here, "People act like I did something wrong. Grant and I have been together for months. His marriage was basically over already. I just said out loud what everyone already knew, that she is not really part of that world. She married into it. She does not understand it." Elena was quiet for a long time. She held the phone against her ear and looked at the clouds she had painted on the ceiling with a toothpick and a tiny brush. Lying on her back on a stepladder, alone, in the second month of a pregnancy she had been so happy about, in a room she had decorated with her own hands because she had wanted her daughter to grow up, surrounded by something that was made with love instead of purchased with money. This woman has no idea what is coming Monday, Naomi said. No, Elena agreed. She does not. She read the article twice after they hung up. She read it slowly, the way her father used to read contracts, line by line, word by word, not rushing. Not skimming, letting each sentence sit in her mind long enough to understand not just what it said, but what it revealed about the person who had said it. She married into it. She does not understand it. Portia had said that, publicly, with her name attached, to a blog that 2 million people were already watching because of a video of her slapping a pregnant woman at a gala. Elena set the phone down on the arm of the rocking chair and put both hands on her belly and felt something that was not quite anger anymore. It was colder than anger. Clearer, more precise, like a lens coming into focus. I deserve better than this, she thought. Not just from Grant, from everyone in that room who watched and did nothing. From the 300 people who stood there and calculated, in real time, whether it was worth their social capital to step forward and help a pregnant woman who had just been struck in the face. She had spent her whole life being underestimated quietly, mistaken for less than she was, smiled at politely and then overlooked. Her father had taught her to accept this, to use it. To let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about her, because their assumptions were a kind of armor. If no one sees you coming, he had said, you can go anywhere. But there is a difference between choosing to be invisible and being made invisible by the people who are supposed to love you. Elena understood that difference now, in a way she could feel in her body, in the place where her heart rate picked up and her jaw tightened and her hands pressed flat against her belly as if to say, to the small person growing inside her, I will not let this happen to you. I will not let you grow up in a house where your mother is a ghost. Harold Vance called that afternoon to confirm that the Monday shareholder meeting had been formally noticed to the full board. Every member had been contacted. Every name had been checked against the trust documents. The agenda had been filed. The room had been booked, including Harold Whitfield, Grant's father, who chaired 3 of the joint ventures between the Whitfield construction business and Marsh Holdings. Joint ventures that, as it happened, existed entirely because Elena's trust had quietly bankrolled them 2 years ago, as a wedding gift, as a gesture of goodwill toward the Whitfield family, who had been struggling, who had needed the money, who had taken it without ever asking where it came from because it was easier and more comfortable. To believe it had come from some faceless corporate fund than from the quiet woman sitting at the end of their Thanksgiving table, eating turkey and saying very little. Does Grant know yet? Harold asked. No, Elena said. Let him find out with everyone else. Harold was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking, the particular quality of silence that meant Harold Vance was weighing his duty to caution against his respect for the woman he was talking to. Your father used to do the same thing, Harold said finally. He never warned anyone either. He always said, if you have to warn them. Harold, it means they should have been paying attention all along. Elena smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 5 days. Monday, she said. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, Harold confirmed. She hung up and sat in the nursery for a long time, watching the light move across the painted clouds, thinking about her father, thinking about her daughter, thinking about the woman she had been a week ago and the woman she was becoming now, in this room, in this chair, one decision at a time. Monday morning. The 20th floor boardroom of Marsh Holdings filled slowly with people who believed they were there for a routine quarterly review. The room was large, glass walls on 2 sides, looking out over the city. A long mahogany table that seated 16. Leather chairs. A sideboard with coffee and pastries that no one was eating because it was 9 o'clock on a Monday, and the air in the room had the particular tension of a space where something was about to happen that no one had been told about. Grant arrived first. He was confused by the formal meeting notice, which had come to his email late Friday afternoon with the Marsh Holdings letterhead and a subject line that read simply board meeting, Monday, 9 o'clock. He had assumed it was some kind of PR damage control session his father had arranged. Something about the video. Something about managing the fallout. The kind of meeting where men in suits sat around a table and discussed how to make a problem disappear without actually addressing why the problem existed. He sat near the head of the table, out of habit, the seat he always took at family functions and board meetings, the second chair from the end, close enough to the head to suggest authority without actually claiming it. He did not notice, or did not think to notice, that the seat at the very head of the table, the chair that had sat empty since Robert Marsh's death 4 years ago, had a small brass nameplate that had been freshly polished that morning. Harold Whitfield arrived next, Grant's father, a tall man in his early 70s with silver hair and the rigid posture of someone who had spent his entire adult life making sure his spine never touched the back of a chair. He shook Grant's hand. He sat down. He poured himself a coffee. He did not speak. 2 board members arrived together. Then a third. They nodded at Grant. They nodded at Harold. They sat down and opened their folders and pretended to read documents they had already read, because that is what people do in boardrooms when they sense something in the air but do not know what it is. Then, at 8:55, the door opened again, and Portia Kane walked in. There was a ripple around the table, not a gasp. Something quieter, a collective intake of breath. The kind of sound a room makes when everyone in it is surprised but too well-mannered to show it. Portia was wearing a white blouse and dark slacks. She was not wearing the red dress. She was not wearing the confidence either. She sat down near the window, as far from Grant as the table geometry allowed, and she looked, for the first time Elena had ever seen, genuinely unsettled. She had been invited by Naomi's office. The formal notice had read simply, "Your presence is requested regarding matters discussed publicly this week." Portia had apparently interpreted this as some kind of settlement negotiation, some kind of damage control meeting where money would change hands and non-disclosure agreements would be signed, and everyone would agree to forget the gala had ever happened. She did not yet know what room she had actually walked into. At 9 o'clock exactly, the door opened. Elena walked in. She was wearing a simple charcoal suit, tailored to accommodate the curve of her pregnancy. The jacket unbuttoned, the cut clean and precise. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except one piece. Her father's old signet ring, the one she had inherited along with everything else. The one she rarely wore because it was heavy and old-fashioned and drew attention. She wore it now, on her right hand, on the finger where it fit best. Walter Combs walked in behind her, in his hotel uniform, jacket buttoned, hands clasped behind his back. He stood quietly by the door, said nothing, and waited. Elena walked the length of the table, past Grant, whose face went blank with confusion, his mouth opening slightly as if to ask a question but finding no words. Past Harold Whitfield, whose frown deepened into something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. Past the board members, who looked at each other with the careful, calculating expressions of people rapidly recalibrating their understanding of who in this room they needed to be loyal to. She walked all the way to the head of the table. She sat down. The brass nameplate was right in front of her. It caught the overhead lights. Elena Marsh, chairwoman and majority owner, Marsh Holdings. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything. The air conditioning hummed. A coffee cup clicked against a saucer somewhere. Outside the glass walls, the city spread out below them, full of buildings and roads and lives going on as normal, completely unaware that in this room, on this floor, the ground was shifting. Then Walter Combs, who had worked for this family for 30 years, who had walked Robert Marsh to his own board meetings when Elena was a little girl doing homework in the corner of this very room, who had watched her grow up and go to school and fall in love and get married and come back to him 5 nights ago with a handprint on her face and a look in her eyes he recognized because he had seen it in her father's eyes too, the look of a Marsh who had finally run out of patience. Walter stepped forward. He inclined his head, slowly, with genuine, unhurried respect. The kind of respect you cannot buy and cannot fake and cannot summon on demand. The kind that comes from 30 years of knowing exactly who someone is. "Good morning, boss," he said. The room did not breathe. Harold Whitfield was the first to speak. He half stood from his chair, one hand on the table. the other gripping the armrest. And his voice came out the way it always did when he felt his authority being challenged. Loud, commanding, certain. "I think there has been a mistake," he said. "Elena, dear. This is a board meeting for Marsh Holdings," Elena said. Her voice was calm, not raised, not sharp, just clear, in the way a bell is clear, in the way water is clear when you can see all the way to the bottom, which owns the Whitfield Grand Ballroom, the venue where last week's gala was held, which also holds 70% of the joint development fund financing your family's current construction projects. Harold. So no, there has been no mistake. You are exactly where you should be. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a phone ringing somewhere on another floor. Harold Whitfield sat back down. He did it slowly, the way a man sits down when he is not sure the chair will hold him. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, calculation, the beginning of anger, quickly suppressed, and then, underneath all of it, something that Elena had not expected to see from Grant's father. Recognition, he knew. Or rather, he had suspected, somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that did the math at 2 in the morning when the company's balance sheets did not quite add up. Harold Whitfield had known that the money keeping his construction business afloat had to be coming from somewhere. He had just never allowed himself to follow that question to its answer. Grant found his voice next. It came out smaller than he probably wanted, thinner. The voice of a man who has walked into what he thought was his living room and discovered it is someone else's house. "Elena," he said. "What is this?" She turned to look at him. Really look at him. For what felt like the first time in months. She looked at his face, at the sharp jaw and the blue eyes and the dark hair that was graying slightly at the temples in a way she had once found distinguished and now found simply sad. She looked at him and searched, carefully, honestly, for what she felt. She expected rage. She expected the cold, clean anger she had been carrying for 5 days. The anger that had gotten her through the sleepless nights and the phone calls and the drawer sorting and the midnight planning. What she found instead, to her own quiet surprise, was something closer to pity. He had not known. He genuinely had not known. He had married her and lived with her and slept beside her and eaten dinner across from her for 11 months. And he had never once suspected that the woman sitting across from him owned everything he thought he had built. That was not cruelty. That was blindness. A different kind of failure. The kind that does not make you angry so much as it makes you tired. "This is me," Elena said simply, "showing you who you married, since you never once thought to ask." She let that sentence fill the room. She let it settle into the silence the way a stone settles into water. Then she turned to Portia. Portia had gone pale. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, pressed down hard, as if she were trying to keep herself from standing up and walking out. Her eyes were wide. Her composure, the razor-sharp, camera-ready composure that had allowed her to slap a pregnant woman in front of 300 people without flinching, was gone. "You told a reporter that I do not understand this world," Elena said, "that I only married into it. I want to correct the record for you and for everyone in this room." She paused. She let the room lean forward. She could feel it, the way you can feel an audience shift when a story reaches the moment it has been building toward. "I do not understand this world because I married into it," Elena said. "I understand it because I built half of it before you ever set foot in that ballroom. The venue where you slapped me belongs to me. The company that employs half the men in this room is mine. The trust that has quietly kept the Whitfield family's construction business from bankruptcy for the last 2 years is also mine." She let that sit. She watched it land. She watched it move across the faces around the table like a wave, each face absorbing the information at its own speed, each mind recalculating, each set of eyes finding hers and then looking away, unable, for the first time, to dismiss what they saw. "I am not interested in revenge," Elena said, and she meant it. She was surprised by how much she meant it. She had expected, in the planning, in the midnight kitchen, in the phone calls with Naomi and Harold, to feel triumph at this moment, to feel the hot, sharp satisfaction of finally being seen. What she felt instead was quiet, clear, the same stillness she had felt climbing out of the bathtub 4 nights ago. The storm had passed. What was left was just the truth, laid out on a table, surrounded by people who were finally forced to look at it. "I am not going to bankrupt your family, Harold," she said, turning to Grant's father, who had not moved since sitting down. "I am not going to pull the funding on your projects. I am not going to sue you, Portia, though my lawyer assures me I have grounds. Assault, public humiliation, emotional distress during a high-risk pregnancy. The list is longer than you would expect. But that is not why I am here." She looked around the table, every face, Grant's ashen and still. Harold's calculating but careful. The face of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered and is already deciding how to save what he can. Portia's humiliated and trying to hide it. The board members, watchful and quiet, their loyalty shifting in real time like flags turning in a new wind. Effective today, Elena said. I am restructuring the joint ventures between Marsh Holdings and Whitfield Construction under direct oversight of my office. Not out of spite. Out of the plain fact that I should have been doing this all along. Instead of quietly protecting a marriage that clearly did not need my protection nearly as much as it needed my absence from these decisions to feel comfortable. She paused. She let herself breathe. She could feel the baby moving inside her. A slow rolling shift, an elbow, a knee. And Grant, she said, softer now, not gentle exactly, but honest. The way you speak to someone you once loved when you are telling them the truth for the last time. I will have Naomi send over the separation paperwork this week. Our daughter deserves a mother who is not invisible in her own home. I intend to give her that. Starting now. The room was silent. Grant opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. Elena pushed her chair back and stood. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She touched the signet ring on her right hand, turning it once, the way her father used to do when he finished a meeting. This meeting is adjourned, she said. She walked the length of the table, past the board members, past Harold Whitfield, past Portia Kane, who did not look up, past Grant, who did. He looked at her as she passed, and in his face, in his eyes, she saw something she had been waiting 11 months to see. He saw her. For the first time, he actually saw her. It was too late. They both knew that. But she let the moment happen. She let him see her. She did not look away. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, long enough for him to understand exactly what he had lost and exactly why. And then she kept walking. Walter Combs opened the door for her. She walked through it. He followed her out and pulled the door closed behind them. In the hallway, he did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply walked beside her, steady and unhurried, the way he had walked beside her 5 nights ago in a service hallway that smelled like bleach and warm bread. They got into the elevator. The doors closed. The numbers descended. 20, 19, 18. Your father, Walter said, not looking at her, looking at the elevator doors, his hands clasped behind his back. Robert used to say that the hardest part of owning something is not the buying. It is the moment you have to stand up and tell the world it is yours. Elena nodded. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked. He also said, Walter continued, and now he did look at her. And there was something in his eyes that was not quite tears but was not far from them. That the best part is finding out you were strong enough to do it. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Sunlight came flooding in through the building's glass front, warm and bright and completely ordinary. Elena stepped out into it. That evening, Elena stood in the nursery again. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, hand on her belly, watching the last of the sunset paint the hand-painted clouds gold along the ceiling border. The clouds she had painted herself, with a toothpick, lying on a stepladder, alone 5 months ago. She had painted them because she wanted her daughter to grow up looking at something beautiful, something made by hand, something that said, before the girl even learned to speak, your mother made this for you. And she made it herself. And she did it because she loved you before she ever met you. The video from the boardroom had already leaked. Someone's phone. Someone's ambition. By nightfall, the story had eclipsed the gala footage entirely. Elena knew this because Naomi had called 4 times and Harold had called twice, and her phone had been vibrating steadily since 2 in the afternoon with numbers she did not recognize and messages from reporters and interview requests in one. Surprisingly, from the mayor's office. The headlines were everywhere. She did not need to read them. Naomi had read her the best ones. Billionaire host bows to pregnant wife. Calls her boss. That was the business page. Pregnant wife reveals she owns husband's empire in stunning boardroom takeover. That was the gossip column. Quiet Titan Elena Marsh reclaims family legacy. That was the one Naomi said would end up in the business school case studies. Business analysts were calling it the sharpest quiet takeover in the city's history. Gossip columns were calling it the greatest reveal of the year. Social media was calling it justice. 300 strangers had posted their own versions of the moment. Walter said good morning, boss, with commentary and analysis and slow-motion replays of the security footage someone had obtained from somewhere. Somewhere in the noise. The actual truth. A woman finally standing up in a room built on her own name. Got a little lost. The way truth always does in a news cycle. Reduced to a headline. Flattened into a narrative. Turned into content. Elena found she did not mind. She had not done it for the cameras. She had not done it for the headlines or the analysts or the 300 strangers commenting on the video. She had done it because her father had taught her that the most important thing about power was not having it. It was knowing when to use it. And she had done it because her daughter, who was not even born yet, but who was real and alive and pressing her foot against Elena's ribs at this very moment, deserved to come into a world where her mother was standing up. Naomi came by at 7:30 with takeout. 2 containers of noodles and a bottle of sparkling water and a sleeve of chocolate cookies that she set on the nursery floor without explanation. As if chocolate were an obvious component of post-boardroom recovery. They sat on the floor together, leaning against the crib that had not been assembled yet because Elena had been planning to ask Grant to help with it, and then had stopped asking, and then had stopped planning, and then had just let the box sit there, in the corner, unopened, like a question she was not yet ready to answer. "You know, everyone is calling you a genius," Naomi said, pulling apart a pair of wooden chopsticks. "Some kind of mastermind who orchestrated the whole thing from the beginning." "I did not orchestrate anything," Elena said. She was eating slowly. The baby had been pressing on her stomach all day, and eating was uncomfortable now. Every meal a negotiation between hunger and the small person who had apparently decided that Elena's internal organs were furniture to be rearranged at will. "I just stopped hiding what was already true." Naomi was quiet for a moment. She picked at a noodle. She looked at the yellow walls. She looked at the clouds on the ceiling. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Any of it? The wedding? 2 years with him?" Elena thought about that honestly, the way she had promised herself she would from now on. No more soft-focus versions of her own life. No more editing the story to make it easier to carry. Just the truth. The full, uncomfortable, complicated truth of a woman who had loved a man who had not loved her back in the way she needed. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just insufficiently. The way a lamp lights a room but does not warm it. "No," she said finally. "I loved him. That was real. Even if what he felt back was not as real as I needed it to be. I do not regret loving someone. I regret the year I spent making myself smaller so he would not have to feel like less." She put a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, gently, right under her palm, as if agreeing, as if saying, with the only language she had, "Yes, that. Stop doing that." "I finally understood something this week," Elena said. She said it mostly to herself, mostly to the clouds on the ceiling, mostly to the small person under her hand who would not hear these words for years but who would, Elena believed, someday understand them. "The prison door had been unlocked the whole time," she said. "I was just the one holding it shut." Naomi reached over and squeezed her hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They sat on the nursery floor for a long time, eating noodles, not talking, listening to the house settle around them, the familiar sounds of walls and pipes and floors adjusting to the end of a long day. But the sounds were different now. Or maybe Elena was hearing them differently. They were not the sounds of a house she did not belong in. They were just sounds. Just a building doing what buildings do. Outside, the city kept moving. Board meetings being rescheduled, headlines being written, emails being sent, phone calls being made, a hotel ballroom being quietly rebranded under a new marquee that would, by the following spring, simply read The Marsh. Grant's lawyers had called Harold Vance that afternoon. The conversation had been brief, professional. There was nothing to negotiate, and everyone involved knew it. The prenup was airtight. The trust was untouchable. The marriage, whatever it had been, whatever it had meant, was over in every way except the paperwork. And the paperwork would be done by the end of the month. Elena did not feel triumphant about that. She did not feel vindicated or victorious or any of the words the headlines were using to describe her. She felt the way you feel after a long illness. Tired, thin, clear. Like someone who has finally stopped fighting a fever and let it break. She finished her noodles. She set the container aside. She leaned her head back against the unassembled crib and closed her eyes and put both hands on her belly and let herself, finally, feel something that had nothing to do with anger or grief or vindication. She let herself feel proud, not of the takeover, not of the headlines, not of the moment Walter said good morning, boss. Although that moment, she suspected, would stay with her for the rest of her life. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true, because Walter had known who she was before she did, because he had been waiting, patiently, for 30 years, for her to find out for herself. She felt proud of something simpler than any of that. She felt proud of the fact that when the moment came to choose between staying small and standing up, she had not hesitated. She had not calculated. She had not weighed the risks. She had not asked permission. She had not waited for someone to tell her it was okay. She had not tried to find a version of the truth that was more comfortable for the people who had hurt her. She had not softened it. She had not apologized for it. She had not made herself smaller to make someone else feel bigger. She had simply, quietly stood. The sunset faded. The clouds on the ceiling went from gold to gray to the soft, deep blue of early night. Elena sat on the nursery floor with her hand on her belly and her best friend beside her, and the whole complicated, beautiful, painful, necessary future stretching out ahead of her like a road she had always owned but had never, until this week, been brave enough to walk. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She was not small. She was Elena Marsh, and she was just getting started.